At a work party, I sided with his boss in an argument, but he got furious. He stood up, threw our wedding ring in my face, and told me it was over. My husband David and I had a massive disagreement recently, and now he's talking about divorcing me. I don't want that at all. I love him. But I feel like things have spiraled so far out of control, and I'm not sure how to fix it. He's furious, and while I understand why, I don't think this is worth ending our marriage over. For some background, my name is Anna, and I'm 32. My husband David is also 32. We've been married for 5 years, but we've known each other since high school, so he's been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. We started dating shortly after graduation, and it's been us against the world ever since. For the most part, we've been that couple everyone else envies. You know, the high school sweethearts who made it. But of course, like any marriage, we're far from perfect. We've had our fair share of ups and downs, there have been arguments, rough patches, and misunderstandings, but we've always managed to come back together in the end. At least, that's how it's been until now. To be honest, the more I think about it, I realize that everything started with my husband's new boss. David had just been assigned to work under him, and from the start, he wasn't thrilled. According to David, the boss was completely unqualified, a classic case of nepotism. Apparently, he only landed the role because he had close connections with the owner of the company, not because he'd earned it. The unfairness of it all made my husband resentful. Suddenly, he was saddled with extra work, not only doing his own job, also picking up the slack for his boss. I could see the stress weighing on him, and I sympathized. At first, I really did. But oddly enough, my frustration turned into curiosity. I found myself wanting to know more about this person who was not only incompetent, but actively making David's life miserable. The more David complained, the more curious I got. Who was this guy? What did he look like? What kind of person could get away with causing so much chaos just because he knew the right people? I felt annoyed for David's sake, but at the same time, I wanted to see him for myself. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity, but I had to see this infamous boss. Then, I finally met him at a work party, and honestly, that's when things shifted for me. I expected someone sleazy or pathetic, someone I'd instantly dislike as much as David did. But he was nothing like that. Sure, he might have been incompetent and riding on connections, but he was undeniably charismatic, with this magnetic presence that was hard to ignore. He had that kind of charm that fills the room, where it feels like you're the only person he's speaking to, even if there are a dozen people around. He was sharp, good-looking, and confident in a way that was almost intoxicating. I didn't want to feel that way, but before I knew it, I had a little crush, just a harmless one or so, I thought. The problem is, I've never been the most subtle person. When I have a crush on someone, I don't hide it well, it just kind of leaks out in my words and actions. I started bringing up how amazing and successful David's boss was at home. Not just once or twice, but almost constantly. I'd say things like, "You should try being more like your boss. He's got such natural charisma and always seems so composed." I could tell it bugged David, but I justified it to myself, thinking, well, he's lucky to work under someone like that. Then came the work events. Suddenly, any chance to see David's boss felt like an exciting opportunity. I go out of my way to look my best, even if it was just a casual office gathering. I dress up more than usual, putting extra effort into my appearance as if I were going somewhere special. David noticed, of course. A few times he asked why I was getting so dressed up, but I brushed him off, saying I just wanted to make a good impression on his colleagues. I told him it was all for his sake, so people at his workplace would think highly of us. I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that it was more than that. David would come home tired, bending about his boss. Before, I'd be right there with him, supporting him and feeling the unfairness and frustration on his behalf. But that slowly changed. Eventually, whenever he'd complain, I'd find myself defending his boss. I didn't want to hear anything negative about him. Whether we were alone or around other people, I'd jump in to say David was overreacting or that his boss was a great guy who was only trying to do his job. I'd tell him he was lucky to work for someone like that, a comment that visibly hurt him. But I couldn't help myself. It felt instinctive, almost as if I had to protect and shield this man from criticism. Things only escalated from there. I started paying more attention to what his boss was doing than to David's own thoughts and feelings. When he'd talk about his day, I'd focus on every detail involving his boss, rather than showing genuine interest in David's struggles. I'd ask about the boss's role, his input, even if David was clearly upset and just wanted support. To David, it must have seemed like I cared more about the boss than I did about him. I would make a point of spending extra time talking to his boss at every opportunity. It wasn't just small talk either. My body language was telling, even if I didn't fully realize it then. I'd be playful, leaning in closely whenever he spoke, hanging onto his every word as if he were saying something groundbreaking. I'd laugh at his little jokes, even the ones that weren't particularly funny, making sure he knew he had my full attention. I'd find reasons to touch him lightly here and there, like putting my hand on his arm during a conversation or brushing my fingers over his shoulder if I needed to get his attention. It was so subtle, but it was constant, all those small things girls do when they're interested in someone. It was all just happening naturally. In any social setting, I'd look for opportunities to engage with him. Sometimes I'd do it right in front of David and his coworkers. I'd act overly comfortable and familiar with his boss in ways that were probably inappropriate. I'd call him by his first name even when everyone else was still calling him by his last name, and I'd make inside jokes that I had no business sharing. It was little things like jokes we'd made during previous events that only he and I would understand. It probably seemed harmless to everyone around us, but I know it made David feel uncomfortable. And yet, I ignored that and kept doing it. The worst part, though, was how I'd ignored David entirely while doing all of this. It was like his presence faded whenever his boss was around. Update 1. My focus was solely on what the boss was saying or doing, and I barely noticed David at all. If he tried to include me in a conversation or join in on a joke, I'd brush him off without a second thought. I'd act as though David wasn't even in the room, fully immersed in my own world with his boss. I'd let him fend for himself, even when I knew it hurt him, because I was too caught up in my own fascination to care. It's hard to explain, but it was as if David didn't exist. It was as if I was in a bubble where only his boss existed and everyone else faded into the background. I was so wrapped up in my attraction that I couldn't see how wrong it all was or how hurtful it must have been for David to watch me behave like that. The thought of how I might have come across, especially in public in front of his coworkers and friends, never crossed my mind. It was like I was spellbound, and David was just an afterthought. I know what I was doing was wrong, but honestly, can you really blame me? Attraction isn't something you choose, it just happens. I didn't set out to be attracted to his boss. It was beyond my control. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it got. What started as a little crush, just a curiosity, turned into something I could barely keep hidden. I began obsessing over him, and it didn't feel like a problem, at least not my problem. It felt like I was justified somehow because I didn't ask for this. It all started innocently, or so I thought. I'd look up his boss on social media just to get a sense of who he was outside of work. But then, I noticed myself engaging with his posts way more than any normal person should. I'd like every update, every photo, every milestone. I'd share his vacation pictures with David, gushing about how amazing his boss's life seemed. I'd swoon over his posts like he was some kind of celebrity, mentioning his achievements in conversation just as much as I mentioned my own husband's. I can only imagine how David felt seeing me act that way, but at the time, I didn't see anything wrong with it. In fact, anytime he even hinted that my behavior was a bit off, I'd laugh it off, saying I was just being friendly, as if my infatuation was totally harmless. Then, of course, it didn't stop at social media. I found excuses to contact his boss directly, even when there was no need. I started with a simple message request, just one little message, thinking nothing would come of it. But when he accepted, I felt this rush. It was like a door had opened. And before I knew it, I was sending him memes, sharing work-related ideas, and even looping him in on minor issues that really didn't require his attention. It became normal somehow, casual, I'd tell myself, but I knew what I was doing. I just convinced myself that it was harmless. Soon, it wasn't enough to just keep up with his posts or have small chats here and there. I wanted to know everything about him, his favorite food, his hobbies, his childhood stories, even tiny details that normal people wouldn't care about. I'd pester David with questions, constantly trying to pull more and more information out of him. Anything David didn't know, I'd just find out from our chats. I mean, if I was already talking to his boss on my own, then I might as well use that connection, right? It's honestly embarrassing to admit now, but at the time, his boss's name probably came up more than David's. I'd weave him into daily conversations as if he were part of our lives, like he was someone I couldn't stop thinking about, which, if I'm honest, was exactly the case. I know I made David uncomfortable. I could see it in his face and his body language, but I brushed that off too. I told him he was overthinking it and that he was reading into things that weren't there. Look, I know it sounds like I'm making excuses, but it wasn't my fault. I couldn't control my feelings. Nobody can control their feelings. Is it really fair to judge me for that? Yes, okay, I can admit I wasn't the most thoughtful, but honestly, I wasn't doing anything wrong, or at least that's what I told myself. And if I'm being totally honest, I think what pushed David over the edge was how dismissive I became of his concerns. Whenever he tried to talk to me about how he felt, I'd shut him down at every single time. If he said I was becoming too focused on his boss, I'd laugh and tell him he was overreacting. If he told me he was stressed about work, I'd wave him off, saying he needed to try harder to push himself more, just like his boss did. Anytime he tried to vent, I'd counter by praising his boss, saying he was a natural leader who only wanted David to succeed, that David was making a big deal out of nothing. It was like I saw his boss as this flawless figure, a person who could do no wrong, and anyone who disagreed, especially David, was just being irrational. It must have been maddening for him now that I think about it. There he was trying to open up to me about his frustrations, about how unfair it felt for him at work, and all I did was minimize his feelings. In my eyes, his boss was like this incredible man, and David was just, well, David. I invalidated everything he said, made it seem like his feelings didn't matter, like he was making mountains out of molehills. He'd tell me how much his boss stressed him out, and I'd turn around and make him feel like he was a problem, not his boss. And yes, I know it's my fault. I should have been more understanding, more considerate of how David was feeling. But it wasn't really all my fault, was it? I mean, who can honestly control who they're attracted to? Feelings are feelings, and they're not something you can just turn off. Maybe it's selfish, and maybe people will judge me. But at the end of the day, I was just following my heart, and it's not like I was hurting anyone, right? Again, yes, I know it's my fault. But at the same time, can you really blame me? I can't control the way I feel, and I'm sorry that I ended up falling for someone else, but it's not like I planned any of this. Honestly, by this point, my feelings had gotten so strong that I just couldn't keep them in check. Then came the next work party, and well, things got out of hand. Looking back, I can admit I went overboard. I was practically putting his boss on a pedestal the entire night. Anytime the conversation shifted toward David or his achievements, I found some way to steer it back to his boss. I'd start praising him, flattering him, laughing way too loudly at his jokes, honestly, probably a bit more than was appropriate. It was like I couldn't help myself. I was laser focused on him, like a moth drawn to a flame. And yeah, I noticed David watching me the entire time. I could practically feel his eyes on me, his growing irritation, his disappointment. But I brushed it off, thinking he'd just address it later at home and we'd talk it out in private. That's why I was so completely floored when he actually called me out in front of everyone. It happened during a group conversation where David and his boss started disagreeing over some work-related issue. I don't even remember what they were arguing about, to be honest, because all I could think about was taking his boss's side. It just felt natural. Of course, I'd support him. Maybe my enthusiasm was a bit over the top, and maybe, yes, I sided with him out of admiration rather than actually caring about the argument itself, but so what? I have a right to side with whoever I want to, right? Who cares if it's my husband's boss? But that was it for David. I think for him, seeing me openly fawn over his boss while disagreeing with him was the final straw. He glared at me in disbelief, and I could feel the tension building, but I didn't expect what happened next. David, clearly furious, stood up, looked me dead in the eye, and in front of everyone told me it was over. Just like that, I felt like someone had just slapped me across the face. My heart dropped. Here we were, in a room full of his colleagues, friends, and his boss, and David decided this was the place to make a scene. I tried to brush it off, to act like he was just overreacting as usual. I played it down, told him he was blowing things out of proportion, and suggested we talk about it privately later. I mean, sure, I might have gone a bit too far, but there was no need for him to make a public spectacle of it all. All I wanted was for him to calm down, to pull him aside and let him know he was making a big deal out of nothing, But he didn't budge. He stormed out, leaving me standing there trying to keep my composure while everyone else just stared at me, shocked and awkward. Honestly, I was disappointed. I couldn't believe he'd actually do this in front of everyone, humiliating me like that. Sure, I know I was maybe a little out of line, but for him to react like that, to make such a big show of things, I didn't expect it. I never thought he'd actually say something in public, especially when we could have handled it privately. I mean, isn't that what married people are supposed to do? Handle things behind closed doors rather than make a scene in front of everyone? Update 2? I don't know. Maybe he was just overreacting. Maybe he had a right to be upset, but either way, I didn't deserve that kind of public humiliation. David was my ride, so with him storming out, I was stranded at this party without a way home. And let me tell you, I was furious. I mean, sure, I could see he was mad at me, maybe more than he ever had been before, but did that really justify abandoning me there in front of everyone? I figured that, yes, maybe I had gone a little overboard with his boss, and maybe siding with him so publicly hadn't been my best move. But this, leaving me there embarrassed and alone, it felt petty, like he was trying to teach me a lesson or punish me. Anyway, I stood around for a few minutes after he left, trying to save face. I thought maybe if I acted unfazed, people would move on, and it wouldn't be as awkward. But the silence was so heavy, and everyone was clearly avoiding eye contact with me. It was like they were all waiting for me to leave, hoping I would just disappear. So I decided to take the hint. I thought maybe his boss, of all people, would be willing to drop me off. I mean, I'd been so supportive of him the entire night, practically his biggest cheerleader. So I casually approached him, thinking it wouldn't be a big deal to ask him for a ride. But then he refused, just flat out and unapologetically said he couldn't do it without giving any real explanation. Honestly, it was a bit insulting. Here I'd been building him up all night, and the one time I needed something from him, nothing. It was like he couldn't be bothered. I felt totally let down. So my next thought was to call an Uber. But of course, that didn't go smoothly either. I kept getting cancellations one after another, which only added to my frustration. After about 5 minutes of watching my app update with driver canceled, I gave up. There I was, stuck, feeling humiliated, and everyone else was either ignoring me or actively avoiding me. Finally, I started asking around, hoping one of David's coworkers or someone I knew would help me out. But one by one, they all came up with excuses. Oh, sorry, I'm heading in the opposite direction, or my car's already full, or even, I don't think my spouse would be comfortable with it. They couldn't even make eye contact with me as they declined. It was like I had the plague. I mean, seriously, these were people I had mingled with at office events and small get-togethers, and now they were acting like I was a stranger. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, someone finally agreed to give me a lift. I had to ask half the room before I found one willing person. It wasn't enough for David to embarrass me in front of everyone at that party. No, he had to take it even further. When I got home, honestly, I thought that once we were back in private, the whole thing would blow over. I figured we'd have a tense conversation, I'd apologize, maybe a few hurt feelings, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. So I went into it fully expecting it to be manageable. I told him I was sorry if he felt hurt or embarrassed, that maybe he was overreacting a bit, that I didn't mean for things to go the way they did. I genuinely tried to smooth things over to get him to see that it wasn't as big of a deal as he was making it out to be. But then he completely blew up. He didn't just disagree, he went off in a way I'd never seen before. He was yelling, fuming, pacing the room like he couldn't stand to even look at me. It was brutal. One of the worst arguments we've ever had. He kept going on and on about betrayal, disrespect, and how he couldn't believe I'd put him through this. It was exhausting. And then he did the unthinkable. He kicked me out in the middle of the night. I thought he was kidding at first. I even laughed, thinking he'd cool down and realize how absurd he was being. But he wasn't joking. He was dead serious. I tried to reason with him, calm him down, but he was done listening. He said I couldn't take the car because apparently he paid for it, so technically it was his. Fine, whatever. I called an Uber, thinking I'd just leave and come back the next day after he had some time to chill out. I figured he'd cool off and we'd talk then, but things only went downhill from there. I went to my parents' house thinking I'd have a place to stay, at least for the night, but when I got there, they wouldn't even let me in. David had already called them, and to make it worse, he told them I'd been cheating on him. Not even a mention of the fact that it was, at worst, an emotional affair. And of course, my parents, staunch Christians and devout Catholics who see divorce and cheating as some unforgivable sin, took his side immediately. They wouldn't even hear me out. They told me I should go back to David, work it out, settle things like adults, as if that was an option. Final update, I was so livid, so utterly betrayed. Here I was, alone, humiliated, and now even my own parents were against me. With nowhere else to go, I ended up calling my best friend, who thankfully let me crash at her place. I spent that first night tossing and turning, unable to believe that things had spiraled this far out of control. The next day, I had to explain the whole mess to my friend, who was shocked at how much I had apparently messed things up. But thankfully, she's been understanding, letting me stay with her and trying to keep me sane. I'm at a complete loss here. David won't let me back in the house, and my parents refuse to let me stay with them, saying I need to fix things with David. I feel like I'm completely alone in this, like no one understands my side of things. I get that I crossed some lines, but I never thought it would come to this. It's infuriating and humiliating, and I just needed a place to vent. To be honest, if anyone has any advice on how to get through to David, I'm all ears. I'm honestly considering reaching out to his boss for help, but I don't know if that would make things worse. At this point, I just want things to go back to normal, for David to see that this isn't worth blowing our whole marriage over. Please, if anyone has suggestions, I'm desperate for anything that might help. I understand that I played a part in this. I even said in my post that I know I did things wrong, but I am tired of people acting like this is all my fault. David overreacted. He's always been overly emotional and quick to anger, so honestly, none of this should be surprising. And as for the advice, don't even get me started. People telling me to lower up or grant forgiveness or to let David go through with the divorce? It was a waste of my time. If anything, these responses only made things worse, and I guess you'll all be happy to know that your relentless negativity and finger-pointing worked out exactly as you wanted because, guess what? Somehow, my friends stumbled across this post and sent it around. It didn't matter that I used a throwaway account, people still found it. And one of them actually forwarded it to me with a note about how this sounds familiar. I was mortified. I begged them not to show David to just let me deal with this on my own terms. But did they listen? No, of course not. They went right ahead and forwarded it to him. The next thing I knew, David was asking me directly if I'd been the one to post it. I tried to deny it. I mean, what else could I do? But it was pointless. I hadn't even bothered to change many details beyond our names, so he figured it out almost immediately. Then he told me something I didn't see coming. He said he'd been considering working things out with me, that he'd been willing to try couples counseling or therapy. He'd been open to the idea of us. But after reading the comments on this post and the things I said, he had a change of heart. He said he realized that maybe some things can't be fixed, that some levels of disrespect are just impossible to overlook. He told me we're getting divorced and that he'll be contacting his lawyer to start the process. And he was so cold about it. He said that from here on, any communication between us would be through his lawyer. It was like talking to a stranger, and it felt like someone had punched me in the gut. He went on to say that reading through the post made him see me in a new light, one he didn't like. He even said that I came off as a narcissist, that I never once showed any real remorse, that I was always trying to minimize my actions and blame everything on him. He pointed out that not once in my post did I take full responsibility or talk about how deeply sorry I was, and he called that selfish and self-centered. Then he told me that he didn't even know if he ever really knew me, that maybe he'd just been too blinded by love to see who I really was. Or maybe he said I just changed and this wasn't the woman he'd married. Hearing that, I can't even describe it. It felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. All I could think was, how did we even get here? Edit, you guys don't really deserve it after how you treated me, but maybe I just need a place to rant. It's honestly a mess, so here goes. What does it matter now anyway? My so-called friends already found this account and probably won't stop snooping here, so yeah, I know they're going to see this and gossip. But honestly, screw you all. I never liked most of you, and you were always more David's friends than mine. You can keep checking in, keep judging, whatever. I'm no longer at my friend's place because, big surprise, she turned out to be just as fake as the rest of them. She kicked me out. She claimed it was too much strain on her mental health, but honestly, she just couldn't handle being a real friend when I actually needed one. I had nowhere else to go. So now I'm staying with my aunt, and let me tell you, it's been humiliating. I've basically become an unpaid housekeeper. She's got me doing all the cleaning, cooking, and even babysitting her kids just so I can have a place to sleep. She didn't even hesitate to take advantage of my situation. And the worst part? She acts like she's doing me some massive favor. I hate it here, but I don't have any other choice. I've got barely any money left since David took 80% of what was in our joint account just like that. I know he has a right to some of it, but that much? It feels like he's just punishing me. So yeah, I'm stuck here, and it's honestly infuriating. I feel insulted, humiliated, and just completely defeated by all of this. I've tried to reach out to my friends. I've tried to reach out to David multiple times just to talk, but he won't respond at all. He hasn't blocked me, but he just flat out ignores every message. Ever since his lawyer served me, it's like I don't even exist to him. All he says is that I'm supposed to go through his lawyer for anything, but honestly, that just makes everything feel colder and even worse. And don't even get me started on my parents. They're devastated that I'm getting a divorce. They're so caught up in their whole perfect family image that they're talking about cutting me off entirely, like I'm some kind of disappointment to them. I mean, I get that they're upset, but this is my life, not theirs. And now, the one time I actually need their support, they're pulling away too, all because they can't handle a little bit of mess in their image. It's unreal. I don't even know what to do at this point. It's like my whole world's turned upside down and everyone's just pointing fingers or closing doors on me. Thanks, Reddit, for giving me a place to vent. But I'll be honest, I didn't sign up for all this judgment and condemnation, and I still don't believe that I'm entirely at fault here. So there's your update. I keep getting messages and nasty comments, people saying horrible things in my DMs. To all of you sending me hateful messages, seriously, get a life. I'm convinced more than half of Reddit is just a bunch of losers with no actual social lives, which explains why you're all so judgmental and weird. I can't believe I made the mistake of posting about this mess in the first place. Maybe if I hadn't, things wouldn't have spiraled this far. But here we are, so let me just give you all the update you apparently want so badly. First off, the divorce has been finalized. Yep, it's officially over, and honestly, I don't know how I feel about it. It was so cut and dry, which is just insulting after all this time together. He had no problem letting it all go. And as expected, I barely got anything out of it. No house, no car, no spousal support, nothing. The car was apparently in his name and he'd been the one making payments. So that's that. Honestly, it's so infuriating how he's acted like I'm the one who's done him wrong and doesn't deserve anything. Anyway, fine, whatever. It's done. Let him live with his choices. I know he's going to regret this. Maybe it'll hit him in a few months or even a few years, but he's going to realize that he messed up. And when that time comes and he comes crawling back, I won't be there to take him back. He's an emotional idiot, and I wasted way too much time on him. So yeah, congrats, David. I hope you're proud of yourself. As for me, let's just say things aren't exactly peachy. I'm staying at a homeless shelter now. Yeah, laugh it up. I know people are going to call it karma or whatever, and I've read the comments, but who knows? Maybe this is just the storm before the calm. I'm still holding out that things will turn around, and when they do, I'll be sure to update you all. Oh, and if you're wondering how I got here, my aunt kicked me out. She accused me of stealing money. I mean, I borrowed it, and I was planning to put it back before she even noticed. But she freaked out and threw me out. Not that I care. She was insufferable, and her husband was a total sleazebag. I didn't like staying there anyway, so whatever. Here I am at the shelter, and while it's not exactly great, I can handle it. I'm going to start job hunting soon and see if I can figure something out. Worst case, I end up on the streets, but I don't see it as that big a deal. And just to top it all off, my parents have completely disowned me, cut me off, won't even talk to me. It's honestly ridiculous, but if they're not going to be useful to me, then what's the point of keeping them around anyway? They were never supportive, so I'm better off without them. I know my so-called friends are probably loving this, watching from the sidelines like vultures. You were never my real friends anyway, just a bunch of David's nerdy little followers. So go ahead, have a good laugh, enjoy it while it lasts, because I'll be back on my feet soon.